The text that you have in front of you is spaced a little bit differently, and at times I will be, I think it happened in the transmission, so I will be summarizing some sections for purposes of time, okay? So I'll try to keep you on track of where we're going. Ontological equality of all humans is a basic tenet of Tillich's thought in both his early writings and later discussions. Yet he struggles intellectually and morally with the reality of inequality, social, intellectual, economic, and so forth, as he recognizes the ambiguities within the actual human structures. In the United States, as well as globally, the topic of inequality has gained increased attention, with special focus on wealth and income. We, like Tillich, struggle with this issue. And my question here is to what extent Tillich's analysis of inequality is helpful to us in responding to today's economic challenges. So this is a bit more focused than the abstract. The first part of the paper sets the context for our analysis, and this I will summarize in a minute. The second part presents Tillich's discussions of equality and inequality with focus on their ambiguities. The third part considers some recent proposals for addressing economic inequality. And the fourth part assesses what Tillich's approach can contribute to these present-day discussions. So first, let me just say, rather than reading all of this, but hardly a week goes by without some discussion of inequality in the New York Times or in other news sources and so on. And so that in itself would be several books. I am skipping the part where I give you some of the examples of this. You can look at those in the paper as it is printed. I just want to mention that in early 2014, Oxfam published a report indicating that the top 85 richest people had wealth equal to the poorest 3.5 billion. This issue has come up with Pope Francis, with President Obama, with the Archbishop of Canterbury, and so on. There are some who point out that income equality is falling globally, even though it has risen in individual nations. But what I can say is that even when people agree that there is inequality, the political answers vary greatly. So this is a very complex issue. So let me start with part B. Ontological equality and the ambiguities of equality and inequality, okay? Since your pages are different, I can't give you page number, okay? In his early discussions of religious socialism, Tillich notes that equality and justice can be empty formal abstractions, yet society needs to fulfill these and aim to make them real. He argues that both socialism and prophetism recognize the demand for equality and aim to fulfill being in its true power. But for both ideologies, transformation or transcendence is required. I'm in part B under, I see some of you looking, so is it page 2? Thank you. Thank you. Ambiguity arises as soon as one moves from formal equality to efforts to enact it concretely in history. Tillich's later discussions of equality and inequality arise in his analyses of justice, with his clearest statements in Love, Power, and Justice and the third volume of the Systematic Theology. Tillich, in Love, Power, and Justice, Tillich posits equality as a principle of justice, but immediately raises these questions. Who are the equals? In what sense is equality meant? End quote. He references Plato's Republic, and Tillich notes that slaves were excluded from full humanity, and thereby also from the justice granted to full humans. We can offer far too many examples of this type of inequality throughout history, from slavery in the United States to apartheid in South Africa to refugees and immigrants, in contrast to full citizens in many developed countries today. Tillich contrasts the history of inequality to God's view of all humans as equal, with God's justice offered to all. As a principle of justice, equality often applies to a particular class of humans, with actual justice based on what those in power see as a cosmic hierarchy. Clearly, this has left many in situations of inequality and as recipients of injustice. Tillich also affirms a democratic equality of all humans, rooted in, quote, the possession of reason in everyone, end quote, who can be called human. This reinforces ontological equality, but as soon as one focuses on actual humans, numerous differences manifest, resulting in inequalities. Tillich particularly notes differences in an individual's personality, social opportunity, and creativity, all of which lead to differences in an individual's social power and claims for justice. But he points out that these differences are not ontological, but rather functional, and therefore subject to change. He states, quote, actually, there is no egalitarian structure in any society, end quote. So equality remains an ontological and theological grounding for all humans, and therefore also as an ideal goal, yet it remains unreachable by humans alone. In what Tillich names intrinsic justice, in Love, Power, and Justice, differences in qualifications occur because all beings have this claim, and the claims of humans differ from those of other living beings, but he includes all beings in this claim of intrinsic justice. People expect different forms of justice depending on their places in a system. Within a more democratic system, grounded in the rational capacity mentioned earlier, different forms of justice occur at different stages of development. He states, quote, the relation of equality and justice depends on the power of being in a man and his corresponding intrinsic claim for justice, end quote. Determining the appropriate justice for people involves what Tillich calls distributive justice or proportional justice, where some individual or some group calculates what is due to people according to their power of being. Such calculation includes both giving someone what they are due as well as depriving people of goods and actively punishing them. For example, many see the current distribution of wealth in the United States as fair, based on what people have earned. I mean, we hear this in the political discourse. In the third volume of the Systematic Theology, Tillich sees social relations, whether within a family or a local group or a nation, as, quote, ordered by rules which consciously or unconsciously seek to express some form of justice, end quote. His example is justice given to a slave is still justice, even though slavery is seen as unjust from a higher point of view. In other words, the form of a social group, either explicitly or implicitly, involves an understanding of justice. And in all social forms, ambiguities of justice manifest. Tillich delineates 4 types of ambiguities of justice. I'm just going to list them at this point, okay? Inclusiveness of some and exclusion of others. Equality and yet competition resulting in inequality. Ambiguity for leaders representing not only their social group but also themselves, and ambiguity in legal forms that bring about both justice and injustice. To a great extent, these ambiguities are unavoidable, whenever people establish social systems, in Tillich's view. Some will have more power than others, more opportunities for serving their own needs, more access to legal systems of justice. Yet the ideal of justice can, and I would add, must, continue to include equality of persons. Tillich affirms, quote, one unambiguous answer: every person is equal to every other insofar as he is a person, end quote. This equality includes all persons, no matter their mental capacity or degree of potential personality. Still, he notes, quote, although the logical implications of the principle of equality are unambiguous, every concrete application is ambiguous, end quote. So should this fact of ambiguity manifest in injustice and inequality lead us to give up the positive goal? In one sense, for Tillich, the answer is yes, if one expects the ideals to be accomplished by humans alone. He does not accept the possibility of successful, human-established utopias. But the answer is also no, where one accepts the demand to aim for justice and equality, recognizing that ambiguity belongs to life. Just as ambiguity is part of life, Tillich argues, so also is the quest for unambiguous life, as well as experiences of fragmentary fulfillment of unambiguous life. Tillich explores the ambiguities of equality more fully in a sermon entitled The Riddle of Inequality, where he calls it, quote, the greatest and perhaps most painful riddle of life, end quote. His text is the challenging verse of Mark 4:25, quote, for to him who has will more be given, and from him who has not, even what he has will be taken away, end quote. Tillich acknowledges that most of us will be offended by that verse, but also notes that one cannot easily dismiss it, as it appears, quote, at least 4 times in the Gospels with great emphasis, end quote. Tillich's exploration of this is simply that, not an effort to solve the riddle, but to, quote, try to find a way to live with it, unsolved as it may remain, end quote. In his effort at a partial answer, Tillich argues that people take things too much for granted and often do not really have what they think they have. If people really have something, they will receive more, and they lose what they do not really have. And his examples here relate to of where if one really has something, it becomes more, relates to relationships, to art, to other people, to natures, and to God. His key discussion that we can relate to economic inequality in this sermon reveals a deeper challenge. He asks the question of original inequality, both internal and external. Why is the power to gain so much more out of his being human given to one human being rather than to another? He immediately connects this to not only to individual persons, but also, quote, to classes, races, and nations, end quote. In other words, the question of social and political inequality. Tillich notes that the drive toward equality of some kind is a driving force in every revolution and war. But no matter the dreams for a future equality, he argues that 3 inequalities will remain. And here I'm quoting, the inequality of talents in body and mind, the inequality created by freedom and destiny, and the inequality of justice, end quote. And I'm skipping just a couple of sentences. Tillich then turns to the topic of individual responsibility. Tying back to the scriptural text for his sermon, he asks, quote, why do some of us use and increase what was given to us, while others do not, and thus lose what was given to them? Is it sufficient to answer because some use their freedom responsibly and do what they ought to do, while others fail through their own guilt, end quote. But while he answers yes, we must consider our own responsibility for what we do with what we are given, he then says that, quote, this answer is not sufficient, especially when we consider the plight of others, end quote. Not all can overcome the destructive elements of their situation, yet all humans have freedom, but are also subject to destiny. Here, Tillich clearly is holding on to the ambiguities connected to individual responsibility. He goes on to say, we cannot judge, and even more, we are still left with the riddle of inequality, with all the questions about why some have better chances, situations, and opportunities than others. In his final effort at an answer, Tillich rejects an individualistic approach and focuses instead on our interconnection with all other living beings, affirming, quote, the ultimate unity of all beings rooted in the divine life from which they emerge and to which they return. He actually has a little discussion where he talks about karma and the Hindu idea and that it doesn't work, which he misunderstands. And in fact, what he actually offers fits very well with some aspects, that one can find in other traditions. But again, they don't mean exactly the same thing, even though the word interconnection comes up in both traditions, okay, in Buddhist and Christian understanding. It is important to note for current discussions of the relation of humans to their environment that Tillich stresses that he means all beings, okay? The connection to equality and inequality is that Tillich uses this understanding of interparticipation to argue that, quote, we participate in each other's having and in each other's not having, end quote. He sees the effect of that awareness as transforming our own experience of having, not only morally, but in all areas of our being. That awareness of others not having, quote, undercuts our security and drives us beyond ourselves to understand, to give, to share, to help, end quote. In seeing others' insecurity, we become less secure. In being aware of others' faults and sins, we experience our own underlying guilt. And in others' ill health, we confront possible disease for others. In others' dying, we confront our own possible death. Clearly, the three anxieties of the courage to be are expressed in this sermon. For Tillich, and I'm skipping just a couple sentences there. For Tillich, the only thing that can liberate us, even momentarily and fragmentarily, from ambiguity and inequalities is the experience of the divine presence or spiritual presence. In this sermon on inequality, Tillich states, quote, there is no human condition into which the divine presence does not penetrate, end quote, a thesis he supports through connection with the cross. So what are we left with, according to Tillich's analysis in this sermon? 1, the riddle of inequality remains as part of life. 2, our courage and ability to deal with inequality comes from our being grounded in the divine life, in spiritual presence. 3, that grounding in the divine life connects us with every other living being. 4, that interconnection of being also connects us to the suffering and inequality of others. 5, divine participation in all living beings solves the riddle eternally, although not solved in our finite minds and lives. Perhaps the sermon was too long already, but I wish Tillich would have continued to say that our interconnection with each other in the divine life and our mutual participation in the divine presence leads us to a moral demand to do what we can to counter inequality in this life. He does not go there in this sermon. Before saying more about Tillich's ideas of participation in spiritual presence, I want to actually turn for a moment to 3 proposals that have been put out to address inequality. And these, I'm dealing with 2 economists and one, and Pope Francis. Okay, so this is now part C. In his much acclaimed book, Capital in the 21st Century, Thomas Piketty, professor of economics in the Paris School of Economics, analyzes the historical trends and recent facts related to the distribution of wealth and income in the developed Western nations. Overall, he argues that there is a central contradiction in capitalism, specifically a market economy based on private property. With much evidence, he shows that wealth accumulated in the past, quote, grows more rapidly than output and wages, end quote, with the result that inequality increases. One of his solutions is, and this is his name for it, a progressive annual tax on capital, specifically a global tax. But he notes that the challenge in doing this is that it, quote, requires a high level of international cooperation and political integration, end quote. His hope rests on democracy with a stronger European Union, but he allows for other options in larger nations such as China and the United States. But he sees a need to regulate capital and to do it with this tax. My interest in his proposal here is not the economics itself, because that's not my expertise, but what will be required of people and nations. Given the role that capital and wealth play in politics and governmental decisions and actions, the underlying question is how could one convince people that such a tax would be beneficial, that nations would cooperate on this, and that regional groups should work together. In a second, this is the second economist now, a recent book called Inequality, What Can Be Done? Sir Anthony B. Atkinson, professor of the London School of Economics and a fellow of Nuffield College, Oxford, offers 15 concrete proposals for addressing economic inequality, which I'm not going to go through here. They're very interesting, but anyhow. While he agrees that it is important to distinguish between inequality of opportunity and inequality of outcome, he focuses on the current inequality of both income and wealth because they affect future generations. And most of his proposals focus on government actions and regulation, calling on governments to make decisions that make people more employable, encourage personal savings, enact progressive taxes on income and on capital, and increase social insurance and protections. As with Piketty, changes in distribution of income and wealth depend mostly on governments, as even when individual actions are called for, government policies are needed to encourage them. I find all these admirable, but as you will hear, problematic. Okay. In recent speeches and in his recent encyclical, Pope Francis also addresses the inequalities resulting from capitalism or actions of developed Western nations. November 2013, he criticized trickle-down economic theories and the idolatry of money and called on Catholics to address the issue of income inequality. In his Lenten message of 2014, he calls Christians to address material, moral, and spiritual poverty, with special emphasis on existing inequality. In October of 2014, he again calls for the legitimate redistribution of economic benefits by the state, as well as indispensable cooperation between the private sector and civil society in order to have more economic equality. In his recent encyclical on climate change, he sees the worst impact for the poor, who are, quote, largely dependent on natural reserves and economic services, ecosystemic services such as agriculture, fishing, and forestry, end quote, in developing countries. And so he then states, politics and the economy tend to blame each other when it comes to poverty and environmental degradation. It is to be hoped that they can acknowledge their own mistakes and find forms of interactions directed to the common good, end quote. So he too calls for political changes, a new lifestyle, new selfless approach, and so forth. And there are more statements. I'm going to skip the next section that dealt with some of his critics. So I'm skipping a paragraph, and the next paragraph begins in connection to these proposals, okay? In connection to these proposals, what can we draw from Tillich's writings on socialism and inequality? In his early religious socialist writings, Tillich addresses economic inequality, at least indirectly, in relation to the class struggle. But whereas he affirms or says that religious socialism affirms Marxist analysis of the opposition between the owners of the means of production and the workers in that production, he states that religious socialism is neutral on Marxist economic theory. And his goal for religious socialism is not to, quote, solve concrete economic and political problems, end quote, but rather to try to influence their solution indirectly. He states that religious socialism, quote, knows that the theonomous order of society to which it aspires must include all aspects of man's being in order to fulfill only one part in terms of its meaning. For this reason, it is not bound to any economic theory or to any mode of political action, end quote. Yet he makes a very strong critique of capitalism in his early writings and links aspects of it to the demonic. Lon Weaver argues that Tillich in his Voice of America speeches connected economic justice and security to maintaining human dignity. Accordingly, one of his critiques of capitalism was that it was dehumanizing, especially when combined with dictatorship. And I'm going to skip that next part. He does call for accountability, so skipping to the next paragraph. Tillich does not address the issue of economic inequality in the systematic theology, but he does address briefly the element of equality in relation to justice. He states justice implies equality, but equality of what is essentially unequal is as unjust as inequality of what is essentially equal. And I just want to say that this discussion of essential inequality needs a lot of unpacking for me, so I ask for help from any of you about that. His example of essential inequality being disregarded is in a principle of equal education in a mass society, and I take that as a critique of American educational systems that see all as, as it being open to everyone. So I find this quite interesting, especially because education connects to people often being able to move up in terms of more economic equality. So. Okay, to part D. I want to argue several insights that I think are important in Tillich's broader writings that I think could be helpful in addressing and being part of the conversation with the economists and with Pope Francis. I begin with the second paragraph under ambiguity. It is striking to me that the ideas and proposals put forward by Piketty, Atkinson, and Pope Francis pay too little attention to the ambiguities and challenges in the context they are trying to address. I find most of their suggestions quite wonderful, but I see little chance of them being enacted. In my view, all three assume a fairly positive understanding of human nature and see possibilities of political actions that far transcend our current political and social realities. Even though Pope Francis connects his arguments to faith and theology as well as science, he focuses more on the ideal than on actual possibilities. In his socialist writings and in the third volume of the Systematic Theology, Tillich also describes ideal possibilities, but he is clear that these will become actual only with the inbreaking of the unconditional or through connection with spiritual presence. And especially in the Systematic Theology, Volume 3, he analyzes at length the ambiguities that are part of life. A second contribution that I think his thought can make is to his ontological analysis of justice and power. Tillich argues in Love, Power, and Justice that, quote, justice is immanent in power because, quote, power is real only in its actualization, end quote, in encounters of one being with another. Structures of justice work to regulate these encounters or their effects, and power is active in all encounters, a very important insight. I give the quotation here, I will not read it, but In this statement from Love, Power, and Justice, he talks about how power can be communicated even in the glance of the eye and the sound of the voice. Okay, I mean, goes into that kind of detail. It's a wonderful quote, but you can read it. You don't need me to repeat it. Similarly, but perhaps more strongly, structures of power are central in group relations, and who actually wields power may be different from the established public structures. For Tillich, social power is hierarchical power, which can manifest in very different forms. Quote, "It can appear in the control of a society by a feudal group, a military caste, a high bureaucracy, an economic upper class, a priestly hierarchy, an individual ruler with or without constitutional restrictions, the ruling committees of a parliament, a revolutionary vanguard," end quote. In other words, power permeates all human relationships, whether individual to individual or in group relations of varying sizes. The significance of this, for the proposals that I have briefly summarized, is that they require attention to who has power and how to work with that power in ways to bring about change. Put differently, the challenge is politics. While it is true that leaders of groups only have power because people in some way transfer it to them, even if by compulsion, efforts to change their decisions or to reduce their power often meets resistance. The three proposals discussed above are clearly efforts to start the discussion and to change political attitudes so that change may happen. But more attention to the issue of power and the political challenges is needed. Okay, let's see. I'm going to skip down to the third element that I think Tillich contributes. I'll try to do this quite quickly because I know I'm short on time. And this is theonomy, a religious vision of equality and justice. And this is his effort to try to balance autonomy and structures. And it again deals with the inbreaking, I need to summarize here for time's purposes, inbreaking of the unconditional and of spiritual presence. It's clear that he has a faith in the possibility of that. And I find in Tillich a never-ending hope and optimism, sometimes just amazing to me. Tillich's vision of the spirit in relationship to equality and inequality includes action against both, and I think it's important to talk about that. Okay, the ontological quality that I have neglected to this point is love, namely agape, and for Tillich, love is what holds together theonomous justice and power, and it itself is a power. Love as agape is unambiguous. So let me turn to my conclusion. Okay. What might love mean in relation to economic inequality? How should those of us who are privileged respond to economic inequality? Most of us have no desire or appetite to give up the privileges we enjoy. This exploration of the ambiguity of inequality using Tillich's thought does not lead to a solution of economic inequalities or of these personal concerns. Rather, I hope it deepens our understanding of the complexities of such inequality, as well as some of the challenges in trying to reduce the inequalities. His ontological analysis show us the interconnections of equality, power, and justice. And his theological and ontological analyses show us the importance of transforming love and our attention to moments and fragments of spiritual presence. Such moments and fragments are our source of hope and also the grounding of the ethical demand that we aim for justice and greater equality, even while also grounding our efforts in the realism of power relations and essential facts of our human situation.